evening. Thank you for having me. My name is Jill Vance, and I'm the interpretive naturalist at Monroe Lake. But some of you, Jeff most notably, probably remember me from before times when I used to be the interpretive naturalist down Spring Mill State Park for almost 6 years. Yeah, so I went to Monroe Lake in 2011, and I have been there ever since. But I spent a long time at Spring Mill before that. So I'm talking about something that relates obviously to Monroe Lake, my property now. But again, kind of those of you who are familiar with this area, those of you who lived here in this area, know there is an awful lot of overlap between the residents of southern part of Monroe County and the northern part of Lawrence County in the 1800s and the early 1900s in particular. The Salt Creek Valley, which is kind of my area of interest, kind of extends its tendrils in many directions, and the families within that area are very interconnected, and still to this day. And so this is, I'm glad you could have me here this week. So I'm actually, this presentation for me is part of a bit of a special event week that I'm doing up at Monroe Lake this week, Salt Creek Valley History Week. So all this week I have been doing and will be doing more programs that highlight the history of the Salt Creek Valley area. And just wanted to quickly reference a few of the other programs that I've got coming up later this week in case you would like to join me for any of those. A really nice follow-up actually to this program here is I'm actually going to be doing a hike/tour of one of the cemeteries that I'll be talking about today, the Hughes Cemetery, on Wednesday morning. And then on Thursday morning, wait, no, hold on. Let me get this straight. It's all right, that one's Thursday morning. Wednesday morning, I'm going to be doing a little short, easy hike to the old Friendship Separate Baptist Church site. Then Thursday is the Hughes Cemetery. Friday morning, I'm taking people out to the remnants of the Bald Eagle reintroduction site at Monroe Lake, the old hacking tower and observation tower. All three of those hikes are registration only, limited to 20 people. Registration has kind of been closing up for them, but if you want to see me tonight, if you're interested in any of those, I would be happy to slide you in. I do still have spaces available, so I'm happy to get you set up for those. And then I also wanted to mention Saturday evening, I'm going to be doing a program at Paintown in the evening. I believe it's an 8 o'clock program on the folk music of southern Indiana and the history of that, which is really interesting and includes some actual musical recordings from folks who lived in the Salt Creek Valley. So I've got some actual recordings from them from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Really interesting program. So see me afterwards. Talk to me if you're interested in joining me for any of the rest of that stuff. I'd be happy to give you details. But tonight's topic is one of my favorites. I am super passionate about cemeteries. I was that weird kid in elementary school who would ride my bike around and go hang out in the local cemeteries just because I'm going to be clear, I was a well-behaved kid. It was like me on my bike taking my snack to go sit amongst the old tombstones and stuff. So I've just always loved cemeteries. I've just always been fascinated with them. And cemeteries were kind of my intro into getting into the history of the Salt Creek Valley area, kind of my jumping off point for a lot of other related subjects. And the cemetery story for Monroe Lake is particularly interesting because, of course, Monroe Lake is not a natural lake. It's a reservoir property. It's a man-made constructed lake, and there was a lot going on in the Salt Creek Valley before they decided to put a lake there in the 1960s. And people were living there, people were dying there, people were getting buried there. And so when they decided to put a lake in there, well, what are you going to do? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. The relocation or not of historic cemeteries for the construction of Monroe Lake. So this is a map of my property. So the Salt Creek Valley area that contains Monroe Lake actually stretches into a total of 4 counties, contains an area, my area of interest is roughly 300,000 acres. So surely I can get to all that before I retire. It is an immense area. The cemeteries that are contained within this area really help capture the history of this area's people and also tell some interesting stories about the development of the reservoir itself. Now, this is a little excerpt from a mapping program that I work with in ArcGIS that I use to track locations. And all the markings that you see here are cemeteries around Monroe Lake. And I will say that this is not complete. I have barely even touched Brown County, northern Lawrence County, and the northwestern portion of Jackson. Every single one of those, and every color, those are all cemeteries. And like I said, not complete yet. Just in the Monroe County portion of the valley, that's kind of in my interest area, we have over 90 cemeteries just in that portion. And like I said, there's a lot more in the other counties connected to us. Now, when the Army Corps of Engineers was starting to develop the plan to construct Monroe Reservoir, they identified 8 cemeteries as lying within what they would consider to be the actual floodplain of the proposed reservoir. And the core policy that was in place in the early 1960s dictated that any known burials that were projected to lie inside the floodplain had to be relocated before the construction of a new reservoir could be completed. So what we're going to do, we're going to kind of go through. So if you look here, this has a little pointer here. So here's the actual lake right in here. And so you can start kind of take some guesses at which one of these cemetery markings might be some of our impacted sites here. So 2 of the cemeteries were actually situated inside the town of Payne. This is now the modern day location of Paynetown State Recreation Area, which is where my office is. My office is right over here off the side of the picture there. I'm at the other end of this parking lot. The biggest one was Hughes Cemetery. Hughes Cemetery is right here in this area. So if you're familiar with Paynetown, this is the boat rental that operates out of Paynetown. This is the little Paynetown shelter. The general store is right up here. To help orient you, campground would be off to the left of the picture here. So Hughes Cemetery down in here. Hughes Cemetery was also known by a number of other names, McPherson, McPherson, Paynetown Cemetery, but Hughes is definitely the most common name that it goes by. So it was located right next to the original Paynetown Road. I said just south of where the current general store sits. Hughes Cemetery, this is a map that was created of the layout of the burials within Hughes Cemetery. So it's the biggest cemetery that they tackled. 206 known burials were identified within this site. Eventually identified within this site. It was a well-kept, still a very active cemetery at the time that the lake was going to be constructed. The most recent burial had occurred just about 5 years prior to the time they were going to move everything. Some of the family names that are found on the stones there, just a sampling of them. May, Wampler, Clark, Baxter, a few of the common names. Well, the other cemetery that was out at Paynetown is now out in the middle of the water right here. So again, orientation. So here's the swimming beach in Paynetown. There's my office. Hughes is right over here. And so Malot sits, it's about a quarter mile, jump ahead there, about a quarter mile out into the water there. It sat on a little 0.04 acre tract. So this was a much tinier cemetery. This is a picture of what the Malot Cemetery looked like at the time. It was not an active cemetery, if you can't guess from the picture. The last recorded burial in this cemetery at the time of relocation had been about 75 years prior. Cemetery was significantly overgrown, neglected, and probably just because it had pretty much been abandoned in favor of the nearby Hughes Cemetery. There were just 7 burials that were located at Malot. 3 of them do not appear in this picture because they had no markings whatsoever when the map was made. Those burials were kind of discovered by happenstance as they were moving these 4 known burials in here. These 4 graves that they did know about, these 4 did have markers of some sort. They were in the form of field stones. Not familiar with the field stone markings, very common in old cemeteries. It is exactly what it sounds like. It is a stone that you find in a field, and you turn it up vertical and set it in the ground and use it as a grave marker. Sometimes carvings would be added to those, oftentimes not. Oftentimes it was just a field stone in there. Now these 4 graves were grouped together. They were surrounded by a fence, or at least what was left of a fence. So we presume that these were related family members. The only info that we have is that there was a carving on one of the stones with the last name Chandler. And there were Chandlers who lived pretty close by. But that's it. That's literally all we know about the people buried in here. Now just northwest of Paintown, we had the Shields Cemetery. So Shields is, okay, so actually I got to update this map. Shields I had marked here. I've actually got a better location on it now, and it's right about here instead. I need to update my map. Shields, to kind of orient you here, so Paintown would be off to the right. If you've ever done any hiking, we have Hoosier National Forest just next to Paintown, and this is the Pate Hollow Trail right here that runs right there. So Pate Hollow takes you to one side of the inlet, and then the old site for Shields Cemetery is right there on the other side. Up here is Car Top, little launching site for car top boats. So this is now a little small inlet here in the lake. The cemetery site is actually above water at Normal Pool. I have talked to people. This is one I just recently got a confirmed location on. I've been out hunting for this before and haven't been able to find it, but I've got a confirmed location now. And I have been told that there are actually some remnants of the burial still there because this site is above water at Normal Pool. So why was it moved? Well, it's still considered, it does flood. When the lake floods, this cemetery floods. And so this is one of the ones that would be considered not under the lake all the time like Malot, but more like Hughes. When the water's up, it's going to go underwater. So according to the core policy at the time, that marks it for relocation in here. There were 38 burials that were relocated from Shields. The most common name on the stones that could be identified in Shields, perhaps not unsurprisingly, was Shields. And then one of the more interesting ones to me, and this was actually the very first cemetery to be relocated. This is the Allens Creek Peninsula. There's a trail that runs right out to the ridge of the peninsula, and it'll take you down into the water here. I love this hike out to the cemetery. It's really cool. I also love this peninsula just because it just looks like a foot kicking southern Indiana, and that just really amuses me for some reason. But the cemetery was located on the top of the toes right in here. Blackwell Cemetery. The second largest cemetery included in the relocation contract. And like I said, this was the first cemetery to be moved. This is a picture of what it looked like. The cemetery was situated toward the bottom of a slope going down into the valley, but was still kind of on this rise that sort of overlooked the valley beneath it. It was a very common setup for historic cemeteries to overlook valleys. So they would put them a lot of times on hillsides, but they kind of look for a little flat section on the hillside. So it kind of, you kind of look out over the valley. So very common orientation for the cemetery. This spot at Normal Pool is about 7-ish feet above the water level. The bank has eroded significantly over time. So this is actually the side, this is still here. The opposite side of the cemetery from this picture is the one that now faces the lake, and the bank has eroded all the way up so that the old bits of fencing that remained are now like falling off the bank on the other side. So this is an area that floods a lot there. Now, an interesting thing about this cemetery is this is considered the newer section of Blackwell Cemetery. There was actually an older section of Blackwell Cemetery that's still there. And it did not get moved. It actually sits apart from the newer cemetery, higher up, and so they left it be. And one of my really exciting finds just this summer was a gentleman who said he can take me right to it. So that's coming up for me this winter. I'm super excited. This is another one I've been hunting for forever. But if you've ever gone out hunting for field stones in the middle of the woods and don't know exactly where to look, you can walk right by them. I mean, you could be 5 feet away from them and not see them. So I have hunted, I have thought I poured over every foot, so to speak, of this peninsula. But he says he can take me right to him, so I'm super excited about that. The gate that you see here in that photo, that's what it looks like today. It is actually still there, still standing, more or less still standing. Remnants of the fencing are still there. The most prevalent family names that are buried in there, Blackwell, Chambers, Casey, Stillions, Connor. This cemetery in particular, there's a lot of cemeteries around in the Salt Creek Valley that have Civil War connections. Out of the cemeteries that were relocated, this one probably has the most. A lot of people with ties to the Civil War in here. Now, the locations of many of the plots can still be recognized at this site. I don't know how many of you have ever been out to some of these older cemeteries. But over time, after somebody has been buried, particularly with these older burials, everything decays. So newer burials, they're all in like metal vaults and stuff, and those aren't going to be decaying within anyone here's wildest dreams of their lifespan. But the older ones, wooden caskets or oftentimes no casket at all of that decays. And so there's a lot of space that opens up. And the result of that is that the ground above where the burial was sinks. And so you get these burial depressions that are, roughly the 6 feet long or so, assuming an adult, a couple feet wide, that can be, once you're used to looking for them, can be pretty readily identified as burial impressions and identified as sites where someone was buried. Well, same thing goes when you move one of these burials. You're removing soil from that site, and it's the old, even if you tried to fill it up all the way, again, fill it up to ground level, if you've ever dug a hole and then tried to refill it, you know that somehow magically dirt does not exist in the same volume that you started with. And so when they relocated these sites and they dug up these materials, they then filled them, but over time they then resettled. And so you actually, at Blackwell, there are very distinct burial depressions that are not actually burial depressions, but relocation depressions. The burial itself has been moved, but you can identify these sites still. And one of the interesting things I found, these two markers right here are each at the end of one of those depressions. So these are actually original fieldstone markers from a couple of the burials that were left behind. Why were they left behind? Well, the contract, and I can't imagine that this would happen in today's world, but I'm not quite old enough to have been around in the 60s, but I'm told it was a lot different in the 60s. They were not as particular about certain things. And the rule, or I'd say the rule was, or at least how the contract was written, was the stones that marked the graves only had to be moved with the burials if they were carved in some way. So any fieldstone markers that had not been altered by carving, they did not require them to move. And so, that was extra work. They were left in place. At least in this cemetery, they were literally left in place. There's another interesting story later on that we'll look at. And what I am told is that a similar, though I haven't been out, in person yet to Shields, I am told that a similar thing happened at Shields, and so there are still some fieldstone markers at the original site for Shields as well. But the burials that they mark are no longer there. Two of the other cemeteries that were moved were located in what was then the town of Fairfax, which is, of course, now Fairfax State Recreation Area. These two are completely underwater at all times. So one of them is right here. This is the Scarbow or Daniel Fox Cemetery. This one is an interesting one because, you think about when you try to relocate some of these older cemeteries, it's nice in the case of Blackwell where I can actually go out and the site is most of the time above water. It's got some field stones, it's got some depressions, the fence is still there. I can easily say, yes, the cemetery was here. How do I do that with a cemetery that's underwater all the time? You can't. And old maps, let's just say they're not as precise as current maps. So you can do rough overlays to try to locate stuff and get an idea on the vicinity that something was located in, but they're not going to get you all the way there. However, this particular cemetery, I can actually say with precision it is right here because it turns out that the plat of land that it sits on was deeded as a cemetery, is still deeded as a cemetery, still appears in the plat records as a cemetery, and the plat records are now available as an overlay in ArcGIS, so I can say exactly where that cemetery is, which I can't even tell you how happy that made me. These are the sorts of things that, well, you all should get excited about stuff. You're history people. You should understand this. I talk about this I just get weirdly excited. And you won't believe it. I found it in the plat records, and people just look at me like I'm crazy. But it's really cool to me that I was actually able to find it. This yellow line that runs through here, this was the original Fairfax Road that ran down through the area and connected up with the road that went down through the valley. The other cemetery is right up in here. It's in the middle of what is now the Four Winds Marina, another one that's underwater all time, and that was the Mitchell Cemetery. So this is that Fox Cemetery. This is the one that's off the south end of the peninsula. 11 identifiable burials in this cemetery. Only 3 of those burials actually had marked stones on them. And we do know, the only reason we know anything about who was buried there is because of those marked stones, and they were marked with the last name of the Lanning family, Lanning. This is a picture of what that cemetery looked like at the time of relocation. 2 possible names for a couple of the other graves that may have been in there, a General G.W. Scarborough and a Sarah Sampson are recorded as potentially being buried in this cemetery. This is one of the things that gets really tricky because, again, if any of you have experience trying to track where some of these old burials are, just because the family said on the death record that they're going to be buried in location A, don't actually mean that they buried them in location A. That's like an aspirational burial location. And you often will find them buried in completely other locations. And this is just endlessly frustrating when you're trying to track these and when you're running into these, these situations where you have completely unmarked graves or just with field stones, and you do end up doing a lot of speculation and supposing and probabilities, but you can't actually say for sure. This cemetery sits on land that was deeded to Daniel E. Fox in 1943. I'm not sure if he was buried here or somewhere else. Is that one of your past ones? Do you know where he ended up?
Malot.
Okay, so he's not there.
Nope.
Okay. There we go. This is a fox right here. A fox of the Fox Cemetery foxes. The Mitchell Cemetery looked like this. It was located on the old Otto Mitchell farm. And so this is one of those things where the cemeteries would sometimes pick up names of the people who owned the land, whether or not anyone from that family would be buried there. So, you know, this family that the family that was buried there may have moved on long ago. Someone new purchased the land. People began calling it after them, but nobody from that new family may have actually ever been buried there. But so the Mitchell Cemetery was located on the old Otto Mitchell farm. It contained just 3 known graves. It was on a little 20-foot square plot. The cemetery was unfenced. It was untended at the time of the relocation. We do believe that everybody in that cemetery were probably members of the Livingston family. Because we do have the last name Livingston that appears on 2 of the grave sites that were in there. Now, west of Fairfax, the Goodman Cemetery sat on what was then the east bank of Salt Creek. It was just northeast of the old Goodman covered bridge, and just upstream right now where the dam for the lake is located here. That cemetery, another small one, about 50-foot square, had been abandoned well before the relocation project. We think the last burial in Goodman probably occurred sometime in the 1870s. So a good 90 years or so had probably passed. 6 known burials inside Goodman, all of them marked only with field stones. None of them could be identified. None of the field stones were moved and presumably are still there under the lake and probably buried in a couple feet of silt by now. Now this is where these things get really interesting. This is the 8th cemetery that was moved. This is another 50-foot square cemetery. It was located along the left bank of Salt Creek, upstream a few miles from Goodman. Right about here, roughly, this is the Two Herons Marina at Cutright State Recreation Area. And best I can tell, I've got a couple of maps that mark the cemetery, old maps, and best I can tell, the cemetery should be right about here. So just kind of off that westernmost boat dock. 8 burials recorded for the cemetery. We do know a few of the names here. Robert and Jeriah Cutright are buried here. 3 of their children are buried here. The remaining 3 graves in the cemetery are probably also from that same family, but cannot be traced with any level of certainty. So likely from the same family. If you examine the full list of individual burials that was compiled for the cemetery relocation project, these 8 burials at Cutright Cemetery are included on the early version of the relocation list. There was a hitch. So when the contractor was actually ready to come and move the burials at Cutright Cemetery, nobody could find the cemetery. Which leads me to a really interesting question. Who the heck took this photo of where the Cutright Cemetery was? And were they just like, well, it's somewhere over here, I'm going to take a picture of these weeds? I don't know. This is labeled as being the Cutright Cemetery. And there is a note on the side of the layout map, because again, somebody went out and mapped this thing, okay? Which is just like blows my mind. Who went out? Somebody had to find the cemetery to map it. How could we not find it when it was time to move it? I don't know. But there's a note on the side of that layout map that says, quote, extensive exploration failed to reveal any indications of burials. And supposedly they talked to some of the descendants who had no additional information that they could provide or potentially were willing to provide on the location of the cemetery. They said they were satisfied with the effort made to locate the graves, and you can all just move on. So again, somebody created that map. Somebody took this photo. How is it that when they went back to actually move the thing, they couldn't find it? So one possibility, I guess, is, though it certainly looks like this photo was taken in the summer when all the leaves and stuff were out. So I presume they were able to find it at that time because, one possibility is these weeds, these grasses down there in the valley, this was very rich soil. And this was right in the floodplain of Salt Creek. If you have a cemetery, nobody's been buried in it for 75 years, it hasn't been maintained, you could easily have, grasses and vegetation grown up, to people height, no problem. And so that could certainly obscure the location of the cemetery. But again, somehow they found it the first time, and it wasn't that much longer before they came back to relocate it. A possibility that teases at me, but I will probably never actually know, is that there were a large number of people, not everybody, but certainly a significant number of families with ties to this area or still living in this area that were not happy with the reservoir project going in, and did not, first of all, want to relocate their homes, but also a lot of people were upset that the burials of their ancestors were being moved. And it's possible that the descendants here did know, in fact, where these graves were located at. We're not sure if the graves actually had markers or not, but an easy way to obscure the location of a cemetery like this in this location would be just to knock over those field stones or move them somewhere else. So it is possible that the family didn't want these people moved, and very simple effort could be done to accomplish leaving them behind, declare themselves satisfied. And so it's still there. Everybody declared themselves satisfied, satisfied. So they did not move Cutright Cemetery. It is still there. The final report on the cemetery relocation project from September 1965 gives us no additional clarification here. The 8 Cutright Cemetery grave sites that had been originally targeted for relocation, these were all updated and notated with just a single word: deleted, 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 deleted. No further explanation. No burials from Cutright Cemetery were ever moved to the reinterment location. So wherever these burials are or were, they still are. So somewhere there off the docks and underneath the water lies Cutright Cemetery. As we move to October, I say that this is like one that's ripe for all the ghost story aficionados, because this is one I can verify for sure that these burials are underneath the water. So let's talk now about that reinterment site. So they purchased 2.44 acres from a gentleman named John Edmund Ellis along Allens Creek Road, paid $1,255 for it. Which actually kind of seems a little bit high for 1965, I gotta say. But they established then this new Polk Township cemetery solely for the purpose of receiving the burials from the Lake Cemetery Relocation Project. This is a modern photo of Sexton Wilbert Corporation at work there, that larger photo. Sexton Wilbert Corporation in Bloomington was awarded the contract for the cemetery relocation. They began work on October 6, 1964 under the supervision of a guy named Dwight Jones, who is still alive. We used to be a funeral director in Heltonville. They're still in business. That's their current place. I've talked to his son on the phone, and kind of begging him to search their attic and see if he could find any photos of his father from that time period. Apparently, Dwight was not known for liking to get his picture taken. And so they haven't been really able to turn anything up, but I still have hope I might be able to get that. But they hired a few locals for the process. So Dwight Jones was one of the more notable ones. The locals tended to be the people who were given special or supervisory responsibilities associated with the process. But for the actual manual labor, they accomplished that with laborers that they actually brought in from North Carolina. These people were mostly black tobacco farmers who were looking for work during the winter season, and they were cheaper labor than the company could get locally, so they brought them in. To avoid damaging the graves or mixing up remains, the contractor was required to use only hand labor in removing the burials, and that's why the labor was such a significant cost for the project. So they had to hand dig every one of these. So what they would do, they would take when they had a known grave, they would put a stake in the head of the known grave. It would be identified with a grave number, and then any additional burials they would discover along the way, and there ended up being quite a few of those would get assigned a number as they were found. So when you look at the map for the reinterment as it would end up, you might see, for example, 1, 2, 3, and then there's sort of a gap, 4, 5, 6. Well, then when they actually came back and started to dig, they discovered, hey, there actually is a burial in this gap, so there might be a 22, right in the middle of the line. They found a lot of burials as they were digging up known burials. A lot of burials without markers were turned up. Excavation of each one of the burials was made down to a depth of 7 feet. Dimensions of 7 feet by 3 feet, so 7 feet long and 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep, unless they hit undisturbed ground before they reached that 7-foot depth. So that would indicate that the original burial hadn't been dug any further. A lot of times when they were digging where they thought there was a burial, they couldn't actually find any remnants or direct evidence of the burial itself. Again, we're dealing with some of these graves where the people had been buried for a pretty long time. And again, I talked about earlier, this stuff is decaying. Just about everything in there is going to be decaying, except for maybe like some buttons, maybe belt buckles, things like that. So if you're lucky enough to see something like that, you're lucky. But a lot of times everything else had decayed back into dirt. And so when they couldn't identify anything they could conclusively say, this is it, this is the burial, they dug down to that 7 feet, that last half foot of the excavation at that site, they declared that to be the remains. And so that was what was taken and boxed up and collected and classified as the burial. Each individual set of remains or collection of soil labeled as remains was given its own pine lumber box for the transport. They excavated the graves one at a time. Each box had to be identified, numbered, and sealed before they were able to move on to the next burial. Again, just as to avoid mixing materials. In the vast majority of cases, the people in these cemeteries said they're either buried in a wooden box or very common just to be laid into the ground without any container to hold them. There were only 2 metal vaults that were dug up in the process. Both of those were at Hughes Cemetery, that first one we talked about, Paynestown, the largest cemetery. And Hughes Cemetery also had a few vaults that were made of concrete that they excavated as well. The contractors, once the burials were dug up, they had a maximum of 6 hours that was allowed after disinterment to transport the remains and reinter them at the new site. The red pickup truck here in this photo belonged to a man who lived in the vicinity of Allen's Creek, and he was one of the locals hired for like a special assignment, and his job was each time they dug a burial up and boxed it, he was the one who then drove it to the reinterment site. Under no circumstances were remains allowed to be left unburied and sitting overnight. So, but also, again, labor-intensive process. You got 2 hours of sunlight left, you're not going to waste them. So they would start to dig up the burial, but if they couldn't get it completely out and able to be reinterred by the end of the day, they would stop the excavation at that point, and then they would cover it with a shelter, and the grave had to remain under shelter and guarded by an individual all night until they could resume the excavation work the next day. The man you actually see in this photo here with one in the red shirt, he was an Army Corps of Engineers representative from Tennessee, who was one of the folks kind of overseeing the project. This was not an open to the public sort of thing. They did, however, invite descendants of the deceased, who they were, at least the ones they were able to identify. They were invited and allowed to come and observe the relocation process of their ancestors. Not many people took them up on the offer, but a few did, and these are a few of the relatives that did come to observe. But you gotta remember, a lot of these burials that were being relocated, again, you know, a lot of these cemeteries, 75 years since the last burial. Going to be hard pressed probably to find a family member who felt a personal connection enough that they would want to come make that special trip to observe. My understanding is that pretty much all of the ones that were observed were at Hughes Cemetery, which again, that was still a very active cemetery at the time it was being moved. Now, when they moved them to Polk Township Cemetery, so this is the current layout, or the layout right after reinterment at Polk Township. The 7 cemeteries, and I love this part of how they did it. They could have done this really simply and just laid everybody out in a line in a grid as they went in, and they didn't. They actually gave each individual cemetery its own section and reinterred them as close as possible to the original layout of that cemetery. It's not perfect, you know, they are certainly arranged in neater lines than they were originally. Here, for example, take this line of 5 here. These were probably like, one may have been a little over here, one was probably a little over here, but you know, close, pretty close. So it's really, really neat how they did that. They ended up reinterring a total of 339 burials here in the Polk Township Cemetery. There were 2 additional burials that were excavated, and those 2 were reinterred at Clear Creek Cemetery instead, and that was at the request and expense of their descendants. So to have the graves relocated to Polk Township Cemetery, all these costs were covered, part of the Corps contract, but when they contacted the families had the option to say, you know, I would really like them to be with our family members over here instead, and so if they wanted to do that, they could do that, but then that was at their own cost to accomplish that. So there were 2 that went to Clear Creek Cemetery. Now the contract specified that the contractor, again, was not to move, or didn't have to move, any grave markers that consisted solely of this natural, unaltered stone, i.e. those uncarved field stones. And so instead of moving them, what they were required to provide when they were reinterred was a marble plaque at the reinterment site as a replacement marker for that field stone, or, you know, in the case of no stone, they would create one like this. So in some cases, the plaques that you'll see there have only a number and nothing else. Like the ones at Goodman Cemetery, we don't have any names associated with those marble plaques that mark the graves now, just a number to identify them. They would also use these marble markers in cases where if something happened, let's say to the marker, if it had disintegrated too much to be moved, if it was damaged beyond repair, they would use them as replacements in those cases too. And of course, when they were stumbling across these surprise grave sites that they found along the way, those obviously all got just, you know, numbered markers as well. Now the cemetery relocation was completed on May 1st, 1965. Or was it? Fun story. These are things that just fascinate me. I love the story of Cutright. I may love this one even more because it's just a good mystery if you like mysteries. September 15th, 1982. Jill was 1 year old at the time. And it was a whole nother story. September 1982, Randy Roberts. He was then the assistant property manager at Monroe Lake, and he contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. One of the laborers who had been out mowing in a new area had found a tombstone at Paintown State Recreation Area. The marker was inscribed. It had the name of a 6-year-old boy on it, Wilson Clark. So apparently, the burials at Cutright Cemetery weren't the only ones that didn't end up getting moved. So Corps Ranger Bias Redding goes out, he checks the site, and while he's there, looking at the tombstone, he also stumbles across these 4 slotted tombstone bases, just about 6 feet to the west of Clark's grave. These surprise finds that nobody knew were there were located just to the side of where Hughes Cemetery had once been. Now, it's not unusual to find isolated burials located kind of outside the formally defined edges of an historic cemetery. So these are often early burials, kind of in the early days of the cemetery, before kind of the official cemetery might have been kind of said, okay, these are our boundaries, and fenced in a lot of times. And so the area inside the fence at Hughes, we know, was pretty well kept. But there was no reason, people would have had necessarily to maintain the area outside of the cemetery. So underbrush may have grown up outside of that defined cemetery edge, obscured Wilson's little grave outlier, resulting in it basically being overlooked in the 1960s. Nobody knew to look for it. It wasn't in the cemetery proper, hidden by the brush. Nobody knew it was there, therefore it didn't get moved. And when it comes to these slotted tombstone bases, well, only marked stones had to be moved. These didn't count. They had no labels, no identifying marks. They were just holders. And so the tombstones that may have been slotted into them, those had to be moved, but they didn't have to move the bases. And so what I think happened is that then after the relocation was finished, they were cleaning up, and this cemetery was going to be located. They had planned for it to be a recreation area, so they're actually doing site cleanup, which didn't happen at a case like Blackwell, which was always just going to be kind of allowed to grow back up into woods. And so they're cleaning up, taking these leftovers, tossing them off to the side into a pile. And what I think is that these were just coincidentally tossed off to the side right next to Wilson Clark's gravesite. Now the Army, this is blank for now. This is like a placeholder slide. I realized I had this in here. I've actually got a contact with the Corps who's trying to track down for me a copy of the Corps policy on relocating grave sites in the 1980s. And that's what will go here when I get it. But my understanding is that by the 1980s, that policy that was in place in the 60s that dictated which graves had to be moved had evolved. And my understanding is that in the 80s, the new Corps policy was that you only had to move a burial if it would be underwater at the normal pool level, not at the flood pool. Not that it wouldn't get flooded every year for 6 months, but as long as at the normal pool, the unflooded height of the water, if it was above ground, it was fine. And so in 1982, reading over that memo, everybody talked. The Corps talked. They asked the park Do you guys want this moved? The park says, it can stay there as far as we're concerned. And so it stayed there. It was left there. Wilson Clark's burial is once again a mystery. Where the heck did this kid go? Those 4 slotted tombstone bases, these are actually my photos. These are there. And if you're interested in joining me on that Hughes Cemetery tour that I mentioned that I'll be doing later this week, one of our first stops is to visit the original site of Hughes Cemetery and take a look at these slotted tombstone bases. So they're still there. And so I had to kind of consider what happened to the carved marker then for Wilson Clark. Okay, so one possibility that I did consider was that these tombstone bases had been moved since their original discovery. Okay, I'm like 40 years old now. We've already covered that I was like 1.5 in 1982. It's been a few years. Things get moved in that time. And so, you know, maybe they were once somewhere else, got relocated and kind of placed into this rubble, and so maybe they are no longer next to where Wilson Clark's marker was. Well, it turns out that the guy who actually made the original discovery of Wilson Clark's grave site in 1982, as of up until last year when he retired, was still working for Monroe Lake. He had been promoted since then, was no longer a seasonal maintenance worker. He was actually our maintenance foreman over at Fairfax, John Thrasher. And so I actually talked to him last year, asked him about this, you know, said, here's where these bases are now. Is this the same location where you found where you found this tombstone in 82? And he said, yeah, it's pretty much in the same spot. So they haven't moved. So here's the location that we're looking at right here. So our Hughes Cemetery was right in here. And so this is right off the edge. There's a little inlet right here. And so there's a whole strip of a bunch of like rubbly stones right in here, and these 4 tombstone bases are mixed in here with that rubble. So another possibility is that maybe the Army Corps later changed their minds and decided, hey, maybe we should actually relocate this after all. You can see it's really close to the lake shoreline at Normal Pool. This site is underwater all the time. I mean, basically every winter since I've worked here, it's underwater. So maybe they decided, yeah, we should move this after all. If they did that, nobody has any recollection of it happening. Turns out we have a lot of longevity among our staff, or at least did. We've lost a bunch to retirement over the last couple of years. But up until then, kind of everybody who was around then is still around. Nobody recalls any relocation happening. Nobody at the Corps recalls any relocation happening. And if they did move that grave, logically where it would be moved would be to that Polk Township Cemetery where all the other graves went. That marker definitively did not get moved to Polk Township. There is no burial for him there. Another possibility could have been stolen. Happens. I like to think that it wouldn't have happened in a pretty obvious location in the middle of a state park. But I'm not naive. We have all kinds of weird things that get stolen right out from under us in state parks. You know, we can't be everywhere at all times. Things happen. But it's hard to kind of imagine what the motivation would be and why someone would be poking around in there. And I don't know. I recognize the possibility that could have been stolen, that could have been what happened, but I just don't like it as an explanation. What I actually think is the most likely explanation, and maybe I just like it because it leaves open the possibility it could be rediscovered one day. Over the decades, there has been significant erosion along the lake shoreline from both flooding and regular boat wake. And so you can really easily see that. This is the Paintown Beach. So this is just on the other side of that parking lot, basically, where the Hughes Cemetery was. And if you compare these historic and modern photos, you can get a really good idea, actually, of how far things have moved. So if you look at the historic image, I've got one arrow coming down, and that is where the outer edge of the concrete retaining wall ended. and also was the outer tip of the shoreline at the time, from that extension on the opposite side of the beach. Right over here, oh shoot, I shifted my photo. I didn't shift my arrows. Take those 2 arrows and slide them a bit to the right. So take this arrow and move it right here, and take this arrow and move it back here. But the point is there's this much of a gap now between where the retaining wall is and where the tip of that shoreline is. And that's how much shoreline we've lost in this area since the 1960s. This is basically where Wilson Clark's gravesite was located. And if you just think about that much material having been lost and eroded away, the best explanation in my mind is that his grave marker is somewhere in this water, or somewhere buried in the material that's been washed in by the flooding. It would have been flooded regularly and intensely, and with all the shoreline erosion that has occurred, I am pretty sure, in my own mind at least, that it's probably still there somewhere, waiting hopefully for somebody to give me a grant to buy a lot of expensive equipment, or to come out with their expensive equipment and somehow differentiate that stone between all the other stones that are under there. And you know, it's probably a fantasy, but I like this explanation just because I like the possibility that it could still be there waiting to be rediscovered once again. There are also a number of other cemeteries that are probably underneath the waters of the lake, likely under the waters of the lake. The ones I've marked here are the ones that I am fairly certain are now underneath the lake that were not accounted for in the relocation process. The Eads Cemetery, the Deckard Cemetery, and the Deckard number 3 Cemetery are all possibilities for these. And then you also have to consider there are probably quite a few burials that were not in known cemeteries per se, that would have been buried, a lot of times children burials, infant burials, buried out back, you know, behind the family's barn at the back of the field. Family moves on, those sites would have been completely forgotten. So these are kind of the ones that I can say for sure or pretty sure are underwater, under the lake. But I suspect that there are a lot more that we just don't know about. But all of these cemeteries that I've talked about, as well as about 200 others that lie within the Salt Creek Valley, kind of my area of interest, they all have these really, really neat stories that they can tell us about the history of the area. I think researching and collecting records on these historic burial sites helps us preserve not just the histories of individual people, but also, you know, tells us some interesting things about the development and the history of the entire region. And so that is my formal conclusion here. I want to just kind of mention that my project to document and track down these cemetery sites, as you might have picked up from some of my comments along the way, it's still ongoing. I expect it to continue to be ongoing for years and decades still to come. And if you happen to have any information about any of these, anyone who's buried, you know, in the Salt Creek Valley, or maybe have some particular interest in a certain cemetery, or can help me find some of the cemeteries that I'm looking for that maybe I haven't tracked yet, please come talk to me, reach out. If you have photos, as I said, there's a lot of crossover between Lawrence County history and Monroe County history in the northern and the southern portions here. And so odds are that I may be looking for information on your ancestors to help better tell the story of our property. And my interest is in trying to gather that info, like the mission of the museum here, to make sure that these stories don't get forgotten. So thank you for having me tonight. And